April 4th, 1977, activists for disability rights decided to take matters into their own hands. They made their way to the 4th floor of the Health, Education, and Welfare Building in San Francisco. It would become the longest occupation of a federal building in American history.
We were loud and clear that if Section 504 was not signed April 5th, we would take action.
And April 5th came and went, so we, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, decided to protest in 10 different cities across the United States.
Including San Francisco.
What made 120 people enter a federal building with the intent to stay no matter what?
Frustration. 4 years of waiting for Section 504 to be signed. 4 years of government delays because enacting the act, which was the first federal protection for people with disabilities,
Was expensive and difficult,
and will require sweeping
change.
So, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, launched a committee to review the Rehabilitation Act.
Which weakened the act,
It made it less like integration and more like
separate but equal. When we first entered the federal building, the workers there thought it was a joke. They gave us cookies and punch like we were on a field trip.
I don't think they understood how serious we were. We weren't going anywhere.
Let's just say, we brought our toothbrushes.
For centuries, people with disabilities have been denied basic human rights such as education,
Employment.
And the ability to participate freely in society.
The 1977 Section 504 sit-in in San Francisco.
With its persistent pressure on government officials,
highlighted the government's responsibility to ensure equal rights for all citizens.
It resulted in groundbreaking changes.
including pivotal legal protections for individuals in the disability community.
Numerous long overdue enhancements in accessibility.
And the profound effect of transforming society's perception of individuals with disabilities.
Additionally, Section 504 played a role in the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which furthered protections for people with disabilities.
My name is Mary Young. In the 18th century, rights for those with disabilities was practically non-existent. As a young girl, I spent many years in poor farms and almshouses with other individuals with disabilities, criminals and paupers, along with mentally ill patients.
I'm Paul Rue. It wasn't until after World War I and veterans like me returned home that disability legislation began to gain footing. At a time when the world was just beginning to consider the needs of disabled veterans, the government had a responsibility to provide for those of us who had served our country and were injured.
I'm Adelia Hoyt. I was born with a visual impairment that prevented me from attending school with my peers. The disability rights movement made limited progress throughout the early 20th century due to historical events such as the Great Depression and World War II. I was schooled at home by a tutor and was always aware of the limitations of an inaccessible world.
I'd like freedom. By 1964, the Civil Rights Act had been passed, which outlawed discrimination based off race, religion, sex, and national origin. However, it did not include discrimination based on disability. I was injured in a car accident at 18, and as an active participant in the disability rights community, I was aware that this act was a significant step for some groups, but not my own.
I'm Helen Bardot. In my hometown of Lusk, Wyoming, I was a piano teacher and crusader for limiting barriers to accessibility. In 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act was passed, largely considered the first federally passed legislation solely for those with disabilities. This act mandated that federally constructed buildings and facilities, such as courthouses and prisons, be accessible to everyone.
In the 1970s, Judy Heumann became a prominent leader for disabled rights.
I won a lawsuit against the New York City Board of Education for denying me a teaching license. They claimed my wheelchair was a fire hazard in the classroom. After this, I co-founded the organization Disabled in Action. We utilized political activism and protest to raise awareness for disability rights issues.
Ed Roberts, an activist who had developed polio at 14, was also making a name for himself in California.
I helped establish the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. We were one of the first organizations to advocate for self-sufficiency and community integration for people with disabilities.
Heumann and Roberts, along with the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, or the ACCD, will continue to push for systematic change in the nation, and their efforts would eventually pay off.
Most notably, we played a role in the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, organizing protests after its veto from President Nixon, who openly opposed the act.
Their supporters would have the American public believe that each of these bills would further an important social cause, but they neglect to warn the public that simply throwing money across does not solve anything.
Despite its concerns over the act's importance, the Rehabilitation Act was signed. People with disabilities were relieved because they are now legally protected from discrimination.
While the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was a step in the right direction, there was little to no implementation by the government after they had signed it.
Section 504, which was a part of the Rehabilitation Act, expanded requirements to combat discrimination against people with disabilities.
Section 504 marks that
No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by reason of her or his disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
in the words of Corbett O'Toole, a participant in the sit-in, that one sentence felt like freedom.
The programs or activities detailed in Section 504 were public schools, universities, government-owned and solely owned businesses, and public transportation.
It prevented doctors, employers, and schools from refusing individuals with disabilities.
If this section of the act was implemented, the lives of countless people would change forever.
All of a sudden, disability rights activists all across America shared one common goal.
Get Section 504 signed.
When April 5th passed and Section 504 was still not signed, sit-ins began across the nation. Judy Heumann, along with activists Ed Roberts, Kitty Cohn, and Brad Lomax, led the most notable sit-in.
Hello everyone, my name is Kitty Cohn and this is Judy Heumann. Thank you all for coming to participate in the sit-in. We were not expecting more than 100 of you to show up, but we have a better chance of getting Joseph Califano to sign the regulations with you all here.
Getting the regulations signed means we no longer be discriminated against. Our rights to go to school where we want, get jobs we want, must be recognized.
It didn't take long for the HEW to catch wind that the protesters were not just visiting.
We plan to stay in here for as long as it takes to get what we deserve.
We've been seen as childlike and helpless for far too long. Not the kind of people who fought back. Today that changes.
To get the supplies they needed to stay in the building for nearly a month, deaf protesters inside signed to activists outside to come to what was needed.
Okay everyone, I was able to communicate with some of our people outside. Looks like we'll be able to get the supplies we need to stay in here for quite a while.
Without the support from all the people outside the building, the protests would not have been able to go on for as long as it did.
On the 15th of April, 11 days into the sit-in, a congressional meeting was held to address the reasoning behind the protest. Judy Heumann was the first to speak.
I can tell you that every time you raise the issue of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country will continue. We will no longer allow the government to oppress us. We want the law enforced.
One by one, speaker after speaker told of years spent trying to get a job, education, and their feelings of pain and isolation.
At the end, with tears in his eyes, Congressman Burton said,
I do not believe there is a person in this room that is not standing 10 feet taller because of today.
The supporters were sure they would hear something from Califano, but they heard nothing. The day after the hearing, the sit-in leaders met to discuss a response.
As primary representatives of the protesters, Judy and I would travel to Washington to meet with President Carter and Califano on a trip funded by the United Auto Workers Union.
The first delegation we have to meet was Stuart Eisenstadt, President Carter's domestic affairs advisor, who would not accept responsibility for Califano's refusal to sign the regulations.
We, the domestic policy staff, coordinate to ensure the legislation we propose is consistent with the president's policy. We've not gotten involved in regulations before.
In other words, he felt this was an HEW issue, not a presidential issue.
With respect, the disability organization is strong, and we feel we're being led around by the nose. Non-disabled individuals are telling us they know best.
Are we just going to continue to perpetuate segregation for one of the largest minority groups in the nation?
The delegates would continue to discuss and defend their civil rights, hoping Eisenstadt would understand their perspective on the importance of signing Section 504.
Hoping to engage the mainstream media in supporting our cause, we sung outside the White House and followed the president and other government officials across the city, demonstrating outside their churches, cafes, and clubs.
And on Thursday, April 28th, Joseph Califano finally gave in and signed the regulations for Section 504.
it was the 24th day of the sit-in.
Our anger was a catalyst sparked by profound injustices.
And with this outrage, we ripped a hole in the status quo.
United in our victory, we finally left the federal building after 2 more days.
We evaded arrest and eviction,
Sacrificed health, comfort,
Communication and hot water.
and still prevailed.
In the aftermath of the signing of Section 504, the biggest challenge for us proved to be the enforcement.
Any federally funded business or organization was required to accommodate those of us with disabilities.
any instances of discrimination brought about consequences for corporations, educational institutions, and transportation services.
This was a stark contrast to past years when discriminatory action went primarily unpunished.
One of the simplest arguments against change is to say something is too expensive, corrupt, unsafe, or impossible.
the disability advocates and allies understood that to make progress, they must be constantly working on solutions to the opposition.
Section 504 was a landmark event that reframed disability as a civil rights issue.
However, it was limited because it only addressed issues of access when in reality disability rights involved much more.
Section 504 ultimately led to significant changes including
Legal protections,
Section 504 mandates all federally constructed institutions accommodate those with disabilities.
accessibility improvements,
ramps, curb cutouts, and other accommodations became commonplace.
and a shift in societal attitudes.
After Section 504 was signed, there was greater acceptance and inclusion of people with disabilities.
The sit-in demonstrated the power of advocacy and the government's responsibility to ensure equality for all of its citizens.
Over 50 years later, most of society still views people with disabilities as an idea and not as real people.
They don't think people in wheelchairs do anything except exist in a sign on a parking space that they wish they had.
The enforcement of Section 504 and later the Americans with Disabilities Act still remain significant issues.
Individuals with disabilities face exclusion from everyday life and its experiences.
And government response has been negligent.
We the people then bear the responsibility to protect our rights.
The rights of those with disabilities.
The rights of everyone.
We, the people,
Must push for change.
Actively resist.
And vocalize our demands.
Life for people with disabilities
Doesn't have to be easy.
It just has to be possible.